Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at the question of the moral argument for God with Dr. Douglas Groothuis, who is professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary, the author of many books, particularly Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith. Second edition just came out a year ago. Dr. Groothuis, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here again.
All right. Before we get into the material, if you could give us just a basic idea of your background related to your theology or churches you've been part of to give listeners an idea of where you're coming from.
Yes, I became a Christian in June of 1976 after my first year in college, where I studied Eastern religion, Western philosophy. And ever since then, I've really tried to defend the Christian faith as objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. I pursued an academic career, and I've been at Denver Seminary since 1993. I've written 19 books along the way. And my real passion is to communicate the living truths of the scripture to the watching world, to build up the church, and to encourage the church to have a compelling intellectual and social witness.
And what sort of church traditions have you been part of, or do you most relate to?
Yes, well, broadly evangelical Protestant churches. I've really landed in the evangelical Anglican tradition in the last 15 years, and I'm very happy and satisfied there.
All righty. So let's dive right in. So what is the moral argument for God, and how do you make it work?
Right. Well, the moral argument is one of several arguments for the existence of God, which are part of what's called natural theology. Sometimes the word is used theistic proofs. I prefer natural theology. And natural theology argues for the existence of God from outside the Bible, so to speak. Not that this ends up contradicting the Bible, but is basically what could we know about God through various patterns of argument without directly appealing to Scripture. So there are arguments like the cosmological argument, saying that the cosmos is best explained by the existence of a first cause or a sufficient reason. Design argument that the fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by a universal mind, and so on. So this is one of many different arguments in the arsenal, you might say, of natural theology. And this argument is basically a two-step argument. You argue, first of all, that there is such a thing as objective moral truth. Statements like it's always wrong to torture the innocent for pleasure are true and necessarily true. Statements that love is better than hate, that female genital mutilation is wrong because it violates the objective rights of women. So we argue, first of all, in the first stage, against what's called moral relativism. And then if there is an objective moral truth about human dignity and about moral obligation and about some states being virtuous in the human condition and some states being vicious in the human condition, then you need an explanation for why those things are true. And then the explanation that is offered is that a personal and moral being, a transcendent being, that is God, is the best explanation for these moral truths, that the universe itself cannot provide that explanation, and that some impersonal concept of deity cannot provide that explanation. So that's the basic structure. On one reading of it, you argue against moral relativism, then you argue that Christian theism is the best account for an objective, absolute, and universal moral law, along with other things like giving a basis for moral motivation, moral meaning, human rights, and so on. Now, you can summarize the argument pretty simply in a deductive form, and I do this on page 345 of the second edition of Christian Apologetics. The first premise is, if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Second premise, objective moral values do exist. 3, therefore, conclusion, a personal God exists. And that is a simple deductive modus tollens kind of an argument. Of course, What's interesting is in the details, right? Because people will want to say either that some form of relativism is true, there is no objective, absolute, universal moral law, so we don't need a lawgiver. Or they'll say, no, there are objective, absolute moral truths, but we don't need a God to provide those kind of things. So that's where the argument starts to get interesting, and that's why my chapter is about 40 pages long. There's a lot to say on those things.
All right, so let's dig into it deeper then. So go ahead, please talk about ethical relativism, both in terms of the cultural and the individual varieties. And then what are the dependency and diversity theses?
Right. Ethical relativism says that what is good or bad, right or wrong, is a matter of cultural consensus only. There's no transcendent reference. So there's no absolute right and wrong, absolute good and evil. Now, the problem with that, there are a lot of problems with that. One problem is you justify whatever cultures deem to be right or wrong, but cultures make mistakes about morality all the time. Think about the institution of slavery across history over time, which has only been abolished within the last few hundred years, and slavery still exists in some parts of the world. So if slavery still exists in a culture that justifies it, you really don't want to justify that culture as morally right. You'd have to say that culture has made a moral mistake. You can make mistakes about the universe. You can think that the earth is the center and the sun goes around the earth. That's a mistake. You can also make moral mistakes, such as justifying slavery. So trying to use society as the final court of appeal for what's right and wrong ends up justifying some pretty terrible things in society. And another argument that I use is that people will say, well, you have to go with a kind of social consensus and what the legal tradition has established. What else do you have to go on? And I'd say, well, of course, there's individual conscience, and conscience is actually, when it's functioning well, linked to God. But there's another problem here, and that is why even say that the consensus is what's right? What's so magical or what's so normative about a consensus? What property does a consensus have in a godless world over the individual relative judgment? So it seems like ethical relativism in the cultural sense reduces to individual relativism, which is my will determines what is right or wrong, period. And if that's the case, then you go from cultural relativism to individual relativism to what's called nihilism, which means that nothing has any ultimate value whatsoever. I just assert my will in a meaningless, vacuous universe. And there's no standard, no arbitration for right or wrong whatsoever. Now, some people will try to live with that. In my book, I address a philosopher, a German thinker named Max Stirner, who held that and just took that to the bloody end. He wouldn't even condemn murder or incest because he said, if my will desires it, then it is what's right for me, and that's it. And there's nothing else to say. But if we have a functioning conscience, we do know that some things, some actions are deeply wrong, like murder and rape and so on. And if that's the case, then we need some kind of philosophical justification for why we take those things to be absolutely wrong, or why we value some people more highly morally than others. Why do we value Mother Teresa over Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or something like that? So we need an adequate justification for deeming some things good and deeming some things evil. And the moral argument says the ultimate and best justification is not consensus, is not individual will, is not some impersonal moral property or abstract object, but actually the living God revealed to us in Scripture.
And then the dependency and diversity theses.
Yeah, these are used to support relativism. So people will say that moral claims, moral ideas are dependent on individual cultures. And that's it. There's nothing more to it than that. So it's all relative on which culture you're in. And then the diversity thesis is that the various moral ideas across cultures differ radically. They're very diverse. So the dependency thesis says we don't need a transcendent, absolute, objective, universal standard because we just have culture telling us what to do. That's it. And then when cultures tell us what to do, we get a very diverse moral outcome. Some cultures favor polygamy, some favor monogamy, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of problems with this. First of all, simply because you learn something in school or at your mother's knee doesn't mean it's not an absolute truth, an absolute objective universal truth. We learn the multiplication table in school, and the multiplication table is not just arbitrary to culture. It's about objective reality. We learn the laws of logic in a logic class, but those are really necessary truths, the law of non-contradiction, excluded middle, identity, bivalence, and so on. So simply because we depend on some of our knowledge on context doesn't mean we have no knowledge of what is absolutely universally and objectively true. And then the second supposedly justifying thesis is the diversity thesis. And even if moral teachings were radically diverse across culture in time and space and history, that wouldn't make them all correct. There could still be moral mistakes made, such as affirming slavery or the subjection of women or any number of things. But even empirically and historically, across culture, there have been broad areas of agreement. C.S. Lewis pointed this out, and I have this in the book. Let me try to find it here. In his book, The Abolition of Man, he finds 8 broad areas of agreement among cultures over time, down through the ages, and I'm having trouble. Here we go. I have this on page 333. The law of general benevolence, negative and positive, the law of special benevolence, duties to parents, elders, ancestors, honor your mother and father, that idea. 4, the law of justice, sexual justice, honesty, justice in courts, and so on. 5, duties to children and posterity. 6, the law of good faith and veracity. 7, the law of mercy. 8, the law of magnanimity. That's in the appendix to The Abolition of Man. And other writers have pointed that out, such as Clyde Cuckholm in his book Ethical Relativity, which came out in 1955. So on the historical, empirical, comparative level, we do find broad agreement on moral principles. It's not that anything goes or that there is radical, widespread disagreement. As Lewis said, people may disagree as to whether a man can have 1 wife or 4 wives, but no moral system teaches that a man can just have any woman that he wants. So there is a sense of conscience. We have moral knowledge. The Christian explanation of this is because we're made in God's image and likeness, and God has written the work of the moral law within our hearts. Romans 2 teaches that. So while we get some insights about culture and morality, thinking about the dependency thesis and the diversity thesis, neither one of those either overturns objective, absolute, universal morality, nor does it justify moral relativism.
And then you then pose the question: which culture decides morality? So how do you deal with that?
That's another problem with cultural relativism. Is if you say morality is relative to the particular culture, then which culture is it? And this is a problem within pluralistic cultures, and it's a problem between or among various cultures. So take the United States and you say, well, culture determines morality. That's a very vague, unhelpful statement, because we have a legal system in the United States, but we have disagreements about morality. We have different religious groups that may disagree on some aspects of morality. So what subculture do you make normative within the larger culture to somehow have the final word on morality? That seems to be indeterminate. And then moreover, on relativism, you could not say that one culture, generally speaking, is morally better than another culture. So let's take something like the United States and our received tradition of valuing the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech, which is really being challenged now. But we have that tradition in the First Amendment. Well, compare that to something like Saudi Arabia or Iran. If someone says they have a very repressive and restrictive view of religion, they have very little freedom of religion, very little freedom of speech, and that's wrong, and the United States received tradition is better, well, you're not a relativist now because you're using a standard independent of each nation to make a judgment that is normative. So cultures need a transcendent standard by which to judge their moral ideas and their moral activities. You can't throw it back just to the culture unaided by transcendent moral truth, because that ultimately ends up in anarchy and nihilism.
Well, then how do you see moral progress and tolerance related to relativism?
Right. Well, it's interesting. A lot of people that, on the one hand, invoke relativism also say we need to be tolerant of each other's views. But the only way to ground a strong doctrine of tolerance is in objective, absolute, universal truth. You say we should respect the rights of others even when we disagree with them. Well, that's a very strong, clear, direct statement, a principle. That's not relative. That's not arbitrary. So if you look at the understanding of the American founding, especially with the First Amendment, it's not relativistic. It's not grant freedom of religion because anything and everything can be true. The assumption is that we need the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech and the freedom of press and assembly and so on in order to try to come to the best rational judgments we can. And at the end of the day, we may have to agree to disagree agreeably. But if we agree to disagree agreeably, that doesn't mean everybody's right. It simply means we haven't reached a consensus in our discussion. So if you want a doctrine of tolerance based on respecting the rights of people you disagree with, you cannot appeal to relativism for that. In fact, the Christian worldview gives us the best foundation for a positive view of tolerance. I can't tolerate everything rational. I can tolerate your belief. I can tolerate you, and I can have a productive discussion with you about it, and at the end of the day, still disagree with you. So that is very much a Christian virtue. And in the history of the Christian church, there's been a strong emphasis on freedom of conscience, that we should not try to bludgeon people or coerce people or threaten people to believe the Christian message. We should rather use persuasion.
How about moral progress then, as it relates to relativism?
Yeah, there's no possibility of granting the concept of moral progress on relativism, because to judge something as progress, you need a standard independent of what is judged. So if you say the United States made moral progress when it gave women the vote, then you're not a relativist, because you're saying it's better for women to have the vote than not to have the vote. And if you're a relativist, all you can do is say there was a change in the law. But change is not the same as progress, and change is not the same as regress. So you need an independent standard to judge whether a social policy or a person's character is getting better or worse. And if you're a relativist, that's just not available to you at all.
All righty. So I found this one very interesting. The argument from damnation. What is that all about?
Right. I get that from Peter Berger in his book, A Rumor of Angels. And it's a kind of visceral indicator that there is transcendent moral truth. So he calls this a signal of transcendence. He gives 5 of them. But there's some actions that are so heinous and so evil that our immediate response is to absolutely and categorically condemn them. Think of the attacks on the World Trade Center and elsewhere on 9/11. So we condemn those as without excuse and deserving punishment even more than what this world could provide. So it's sort of the damn it response, which is not merely swearing, but it's the idea of an absolute condemnation of something as evil without excuse and an evil that deserves a supernatural punishment. So this signal of transcendence is an indicator of moral truth, of transcendent moral truth. So you really can't say with a good conscience, well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That would be to relativize everything and to drain moral meaning out of the world. So I think that kind of thing is an indicator or like a flashpoint that we have a conscience that does recognize some actions and even some habits as objectively evil. And if they're objectively evil, then there is a original objective good that the evil defects from and is a corruption from.
All right, but isn't the whole thing dependent on the idea that there is a supernatural realm, that there is life after death?
Well, it indicates that. It cries out for that. It's not an argument for heaven or hell, but it's a kind of existential response to extreme evil that calls out for divine judgment. That's about as far as you can take it. And that's about as far as Berger will push it in his book, A Rumor of Angels. And also Os Guinness has written a whole book on signals of transcendence, which came out within the last year, I believe, which is very worthwhile. So if we really want to know about the afterlife, we have to go far beyond our visceral response to terrorism and rape and human trafficking. We need to go to scripture as to the final fate of evil doers who are unrepentant. But this is basically an awareness, a sense of divine justice that God has ingrained in our conscience.
All right, and you already mentioned Max Stirner, but what is the relationship of relativism to nihilism, and how does Max Stirner exemplify nihilism?
Right. I think a lot of people want a kind of tame, unoffensive relativism. Not as many as it used to be, but kind of live and let live. Don't push your beliefs on me. I won't push my beliefs on you. Although I think that's really changing now with woke culture. But as I mentioned, relativism is not a soft and tame position. Relativism unhinges morality from any objective moral order. And when that happens, ultimately anything goes, because you have no transcendent set of moral truths that you are aware of. It doesn't exist. And so morality is dissolved into the will. And some people, as Max Stirner put it, will continue to be pious. They'll be pious atheists. That is, they will not take atheism to its logical conclusion. But he did. He said, there's no God, there's no moral law. Human beings have no essence. He was like Jean-Paul Sartre in that respect, from existentialism and human emotions. There's no God, there's no human nature, made in the image and likeness of God. So all we have is a free-floating will in a meaningless universe. So anything is justified if I will it, if I will it. Now, often people appeal to Friedrich Nietzsche for this kind of thing, and I think rightly so. And I've written about Nietzsche elsewhere in my book, World Religion in 7 Sentences. I have a chapter on Nietzsche, his God is dead statement. But many years ago, I got onto Max Stirner, who's not as well known, but Stirner is perhaps even more ruthless and rigorously, systematically consistent in his atheism. even than Nietzsche. So this is what's called a reductio ad absurdum argument. Relativism reduces to nihilism. Nihilism is ultimately absurd and unlivable. Therefore, relativism is false. Therefore, we have to find a better account of morality. And that's what we have if we posit that there is an infinite personal God who is the source of the moral law and who governs the moral universe and gives us moral motivation and so on.
All right. And then moving to a different way of thinking, what do you do with non-dualistic pantheism?
Right. Well, that's utterly unable to ground objective, absolute, universal morality. That's the idea that instead of viewing the universe as being created by God, that everything is divine and everything is one. Now, if that's the case, then you don't have a moral lawgiver at all. You simply have this universal, amoral, impersonal substance or something or principle, and that couldn't possibly be the basis for morality. In fact, morality dissolves for two reasons. There's no creator-creation distinction. Everything is one, and that great oneness in pantheistic monism is not personal, not the great I am who I am, but just it is what it is, and we can't ascribe any meaningful predicates to what it is. There's this strong ineffability claim in pantheistic monism. So pantheistic monism could not be a support for objective morality. There's also no sense of providence that God is guiding the universe towards a finally good telos or end. That's not a part of a pantheistic monistic system. So while that is a religious answer to find moral meaning and moral justification, it's logically unsupportable.
So how about the two truths theory within non-dualistic pantheism?
Yeah, well, that's an attempt to rescue the intrinsic philosophical problems with pantheism. It was presented by Shankara, the Hindu philosopher who lived from, 788 to 820 AD. And that's the idea that one truth is we talk about a personal God and individual entities and objects and processes. That's one truth, but the ultimate truth is everything is one and everything is divine. But the problem is that contradictory truth claims cannot both be true. So truth is one, and this two-truth view just doesn't account for the way reality is or how the rational mind works. It's a way to try to honor the world of diversity and plurality and individuality without giving it a created objective status. And that's what Christianity does. We say there's one true God who created the universe, designed it, structured it. He is distinct from the world. And he created the world as a place of events and people and history, and it all has meaning. But there's a real distinction between the eternal creator and the finite creation. And those are equally real. Now, God's eternal and the universe is temporal, but they're equally objectively facts. And we don't somehow relativize the world of creation and absorb it into this one universal being. It's not the way reality is.
But then how does that work, the two truths theory, work with morality?
It doesn't work at all. You would have to somehow say that moral truths are relative or they seem to be real, but they're not ultimately real. And if that's true, then you're just back into relativism again. So anytime you assert a two-truth idea that one thing can be true and the opposite can be true, you're in trouble, basically, unless you really specify what domain you're speaking of. But if you're talking about objective reality, then A and non-A cannot both be true of the same objective reality. And Christianity doesn't have to posit anything like a two-truth theory. A great maxim for Christian thinking down through the ages is all truth is God's truth. and God has revealed himself in nature, in scripture, in the person of Jesus Christ. And all these truths cohere into a beautiful, unified worldview.
So you tell a story in there that kind of sums this whole thing up, the inability of the two truths theory to work for morality.
Yeah, I give an example for how non-dualism cannot account for morality. This is in Robert Persic's popular novel, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He recounts a lecture, I'm reading from the book, he attended in India. The professor was expounding on the illusory nature of the world, and Persic asked if it were true that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were illusory. To this, the professor smiled and said yes. At this point, Persic left the classroom, left India, gave up. So I write, to deny objective moral reality is illogical and unlivable. Unless an individual is a sociopath, he or she cannot live as if morality does not exist. So non-dualistic pantheism fails the test of livability or practicality. So if you think that everything is one and everything is divine, then really there is no good, there is no evil. There's just this one faceless something that no one can ultimately understand or address. And if you don't think that there is evil in the world, then you're intellectually unhinged. You're unmoored from reality. So any worldview that denies the existence of objective good and evil has to be false. And that's what it comes down to with pantheistic monism.
All right. Yeah, I think that story really sums it up well. All right. So how does atheism understand morality and consider the argument that morality is a biological adaptation?
Right. Well, atheists have several possibilities for dealing with morality. They can go all the way with Max Stirner and become nihilists, or they can try to appeal to evolutionary history to construct some kind of moral system. The essence of the problem with that is that you can't derive an ought from an is. You can look at a long biological process of evolution, eventuating in human beings and human societies over tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And you have certain patterns of behavior that have been conducive to survival. But that's not the same as saying that those patterns of behavior are necessarily good. All you're saying is that some mores and some rules have emerged over time through evolutionary development. But that's not the same as rendering a judgment about which of these principles are good and which are not. Because merely surviving is not a moral property. One society could survive by ruthlessly dominating all the others and killing their enemies. That's exactly what the Third Reich tried to do. So there's more to the story, but the problem is that if you only appeal to a naturalistic evolutionary process, you do not have moral truth available. You simply have descriptive statements about what has transpired through biological and historical processes. And if you make survival the ultimate value, that could lead to any number of outcomes. You could have survival through a very ruthless and cruel system, or perhaps you could create societies conducive to survival through some other moral values, but it's basically indeterminate. It doesn't give you a hard right or wrong, good or evil. So what the naturalists can do, and there's one other option we can talk about, is just go full-on nihilism, or they could try to ground morality in an evolutionary process, which fails because you can't really derive the ought from the is. Or you could say, well, there are actually objective moral truths, but they're not connected to God. And this is a view called atheistic moral realism that I address in the book. Now, this view has as a benefit that it affirms there are objective moral truths, and that is the case. Nihilism is not true. You can't ground morality on Darwinian evolutionary patterns. So atheistic moral realism is correct in terms of identifying certain truths. The issue is, how do you explain the existence of these truths in a godless universe that has no purpose or direction? And there are a number of problems with this. I think I give 6 in the book, but let's just talk about a couple of them. One is, this is a very strange ontology, right? The Christian worldview says that God is the infinite, eternal source of all that is good. He made us in his image, gave us a conscience, revealed himself in nature and conscience, and ultimately in Christ and the scripture. So we can have the knowledge of God as possible for human beings in a meaningful teleological universe. Now, what atheistic moral realism says is, well, we have one element of that abstracted from all the rest. There are objective, absolute, universal moral truths, but they're not placed in a divine mind. They're not thoughts of God. We were not created to know them with a purpose and a meaning. They're just there in the universe, and human beings evolved without any plan or purpose, and somehow, through our biological mechanisms, came to a knowledge of these immaterial, objective, abstract truths. And we should act on them. So this is a bizarre ontology. How exactly do you coordinate and arrange these objective, abstract truths to purely biological creatures who were not created or designed to know them? It would just be happenstance that we know them. It would be extremely improbable. And then also, when you think about the nature of morality, there's way more to morality than just the knowledge of abstract truths, such as love is better than hate, or you should not torture someone for pleasure. Morality also involves a sense of obligation. That is, we have duties. And even the atheistic philosopher Richard Taylor pointed this out, that the concept of duty and obligation is really a personal relationship. And that's what theism provides for us, that God is not just a set of moral truths that exist in his divine mind. That's true. But God is a commander. God says, you should do this, and you should not do this. You have a duty to do X. You have a duty to avoid Y. And so we have the structure of the Ten Commandments. Atheistic moral realism cannot provide anything like that. So basically, it's like we have an atheistic worldview, a one-circle worldview. It's not God in the world. It's just the world, a set of natural states that could be described by chemistry, biology, and physics. Wasn't created, has no telos. But in addition to this natural world, there are these non-natural properties. Sometimes they're called abstract objects. They're moral truths. They're just there. So you're taking certain elements of Christian theism, meaning abstract, absolute, universal moral truths, but you're separating them from a divine mind. So you have propositions without a mind, which is an odd metaphysic in itself. And then somehow human beings who were not designed to know these things just happen to know these things. But there's no basis for obligation, because you really need a personal relationship. You need a personal accountability to a higher authority to have obligation. And morality always involves a sense of obligation. It's not just facts about reality that are moral, but imperatives and commands. So I've got 6 objections in the book. I just broached 2 or 3 of them. So the naturalistic view fails to account for morality, either because it leads to nihilism or because it tries to ground morality on Darwinian mechanisms, which fails, or you posit objective, absolute, universal moral truths that are just there in the universe. And that is a terribly inadequate explanation unless those moral truths are resident in the mind of a knowing, living, commanding, governing creator.
All right. So, how did atheistic existentialists attempt to offer more than nihilism?
Yes, what the existentialists attempt to do is to say that the universe is objectively meaningless. There is no God. There is no human nature that is a basis for our identity or that is normative for us. That is, you couldn't say, because I'm a human, I need to do X, Y, or Z. We're simply wills in a meaningless world, but somehow by asserting the will, we can create meaning. We can forge meaning. And I'm thinking especially here of Jean-Paul Sartre, but to some extent you see this in Albert Camus with his idea that life is absurd, but somehow humans can revolt against the absurdity and find meaning. And the basic critique of that is from nothing, nothing comes. So if the universe in and of itself objectively is without meaning, purpose, value, significance, and worth, then it doesn't matter how insistent or how dramatic or how histrionic your will is. You know, I assert this, the assertion is still meaningless. So you may find it psychologically thrilling, or you may gain a following. You may write a bunch of big ponderous books like Jean-Paul Sartre did. But in the final analysis, you die and all the meaning dies and everything remains meaningless. So it's interesting, I found in the last 15 years, a resurgence of interest in existentialism. This was very popular after World War II, and I'd say through late 70s to the mid 80s, and then there was a hiatus of interest in existentialism, except maybe academically. And then 10, 15 years ago, through the writings of a guy named Gary Cox, the existentialism, the atheistic existentialism, particularly of Jean-Paul Sartre, was given a kind of facelift or brought back into the fore. But it's just as bankrupt and just as bereft of meaning and significance as it ever was, really.
So, according to Yale law professor Arthur Leff, we moderns want to affirm two contradictory things. There is a complete, transcendent, and immanent set of propositions about right and wrong, findable rules that authoritatively and unambiguously direct us how to live righteously. That's the first one. And the second one, we are wholly free not only to choose for ourselves what we ought to do, but to decide for ourselves as individuals and as a species what we ought to be. So how do you address this contradiction?
Yeah, this was from an article in a 1979 Duke Law Review periodical. That's quite compelling. Arthur Leff was a professor of law, and he wrote this essay in 1979 that I draw from in my book. And he shows that on the one hand, we want moral truth to condemn evil and to commend what is right. On the other hand, we want to create moral truth for ourselves so we can be completely free from God. And he does not resolve this in the article at all. He says basically, unless there is an evaluator in chief, unless there is a God who says what is right and says what is wrong, there is no ultimate right or wrong. But we can't have that because we have to be free. We have to be autonomous moral agents. So at the end of the article, he mentions that some things are absolutely right and some things are absolutely wrong. It's kind of a poetic ending to the article. But then he says who? Says who? God help us. So I work on that article in some detail in the chapter, and I can't summarize all of it, but it really comes down to this: either God or nihilism. Not nihilism, therefore God. But Leff does not draw that conclusion. He gives us all the resources to draw that conclusion and then leaves it completely up in the air. It's a fascinating article. I've read it and taught it for years and years. And it's a case where a non-Christian deeply delves into the inner logic of the Christian view of morality and what is involved and entailed by rejecting that Christian view of morality for a secular account. And then he reaches this impasse and he does not resolve it. But the resolution is actually very straightforward, and that is that personal, infinite God is the basis of the moral law and is in the position to render final judgments about what is good and what is evil and what is right and what is wrong and what is virtuous and what is vicious and what a good society looks like and what a bad society looks like. So he gives us the resources to make these judgments, but somehow he doesn't really say why. He thinks that a theistic explanation, a theistic hypothesis to explain morality is simply not available to us. But he is in no way content or happy with the secular conclusion that he comes to. So he ends the article basically by saying, I have no resolution for this. It's quite dramatic.
Yeah, that's a great ending. Says who, but then he refers to God. So
yeah.
All right. So you spend more time than looking at the thought of Arthur Leff and the question of ultimate objective moral authority. So please talk about Leff's descriptivism and his personalism and where he finally comes out on his question of objective moral reality or authority.
Yeah, well, what Leff does in the article is he pursues non-theistic possibilities for moral evaluation. So one is just descriptivism. What have societies deemed right or wrong, good or evil over time? And as I said earlier in the interview, describing states of affairs is not the same as evaluating them. And it's an inadequate basis for determining what is ultimately right or wrong. So he's very thorough in the article. He says, okay, if we don't have a evaluator in chief who renders final judgments on states of affairs, then we're thrown back to society, and it ultimately becomes conventional and contingent and arbitrary, one way or the other. And if so, you don't have a final word of truth about morality. And he says we yearn for that. In fact, let me read you this. Leff says basically, without God, we have no final moral evaluation on states of affairs, because he's looked at the other possibilities that are merely human, merely psychological, merely legal. So this is how he ends his essay. All I can say is this: it looks as if we are all we have. Why say that? We are all we have. But that's where he's at. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Neither reason nor love nor even terror seems to have worked to make us quote unquote good. And worse than that, there's no reason why anything should. Now listen to this. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. So he's saying, only if ethics were something unspeakable by us, he means speakable by God, the ultimate authority, right? He says, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amin, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesce deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. Altogether now, says who? God help us. God help us. God can help us. The moral argument for God is very profound. And the existence of God is the grounding of the objective moral law, moral obligation, moral hope for a fallen world, and all the rest of it. And Leff laid out the argument for that so powerfully, but for some reason he said it looks as if we are all that we have. It's not true. We have God.
All right. So not much hope there, but
No.
So Finally, our last question here, you point out that both some theists and atheists object to the moral argument for God, asserting that moral truths are necessary truths. So how do you deal with this idea of necessary truths?
Right. This goes back to atheistic moral realism. And a necessary truth is a statement that cannot be false. It must be true. Like 2 + 2 = 4. The law of non-contradiction, a triangle has only 3 sides, things like that. So some atheists want to say, we don't need a God to make necessary truths true. They simply are true in a godless world. Okay. So the best explanation of this is that necessary truths reside in the mind of God, that God himself is a necessary being, and any version of the ontological argument that succeeds makes this point, and I have a chapter in the book on the ontological argument. So I think we can better relate the necessary truths of morality to the necessary being of God than somehow abstract these necessary truths from God and just inject them into an otherwise meaningless universe. Moreover, we have lots of other good arguments for God's existence, such as design arguments, cosmological arguments, religious experience arguments, and so on. So the overall cumulative case for Christian theism is extremely strong, and that does include some necessary truths of morality, but those necessary truths of morality are best understood as eternal thoughts in the mind of a necessarily existing and self-existent being, the great I am who I am of Exodus 3:14. That's a short answer. It gets a little more complicated in the book, but I think that's a decent shot at it.
Excellent. All right, well, I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been looking at the question of the moral argument for God with Dr. Douglas Groothuis, who's professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary and the author of Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for biblical faith. Follow the link below to check it out. Dr. Groothuis, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.